Little Brother, Chapter 12, Evacuation. How can he be here? Oliver demanded. It makes no sense. I do not know, but here he lies, in the flesh. Basil checked his brother's breathing once again. The sounds in his lungs remained strong. He was unconscious, but did not appear to be critically wounded. I am worried about that injury to his head, Basil mumbled. We should be able to get the metal pieces out of his legs easily enough, but it looks like he slammed his skull pretty hard against the tree. Oliver frowned. What are we going to do with him? He needs to see a doctor, but we cannot take him back to our house. The British are everywhere in town. Somehow we have to get him to the Continentals. We can try their encampment first. How will we get him there? Oliver challenged. It is over 2 miles away. He pointed toward the south. We can make a litter and drag him through the woods. It's only about a half mile to the big buffalo trail. The wagon that we hid in the woods is not far. We can load him in the rig and take him to the American surgeons. What about the horses? They are back in the barn, Oliver observed. Basil nodded. If you will sit with Walter, when we reach the wagon, I will sneak into the barn and get the team of horses. We can get him to the Patriot encampment within the hour. Oliver nodded excitedly. It's a good plan, Basil. It took longer than the boys anticipated to move the wounded Walter Billingsley. They rigged a litter out of sapling poles and the wool coats of 2 fallen British soldiers. Despite his emaciated state and loss of weight during captivity, Walter was still a heavy load for them to drag. The boys were exhausted when, over an hour later, they reached the wagon in its place of concealment deep in the woods. The boys struggled to load Walter in the back of the wagon, but eventually succeeded in completing the difficult task. All right, Oliver, you remain here and rest whilst I go and fetch the horses. I'm mighty thirsty, Oliver groaned. Basil pointed to his right. There is a spring about 40 yards up this path. Take 2 of the canteens from beneath the wagon seat. Drink what you want at the spring and then fill both of them. Try to get some water into Walter. Hopefully he will be able to swallow. Then wait for me to return. Stay with the wagon. Remain out of sight and keep quiet. I will get back as quickly as I can. Yes, Basil. Oliver trembled slightly with fear. A cannon exploded in the distance. Oliver instinctively dipped his head. A frown of worry filled his face. Basil reassured him. Everything will be all right, Ollie. There are no British near here. They are several miles to the west. You will be safe, I promise. Basil reached for the lad and pulled him close. He hugged him tightly. I will be waiting for you, right here at the wagon, Oliver declared. Basil grinned, knocked Oliver's black cocked hat off of his head, and tousled his already messy hair. Then, quick as a flash, he jumped from the wagon bed and took off running down the trail toward home. Late afternoon, near the American encampment. At long last, the rumble of cannons had stopped. There was no more shooting, no more drums, and no more screaming voices echoing across the fields and valleys of Guilford County. Finally, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was over. Basil was completely exhausted, though he was worried about his mother and sister. All of his attention was focused on his brother, Walter. He simply had to get to the doctors at the Patriot encampment. He snapped the reins and clucked at his team of horses, urging the animals onward along the rutted, dusty road. The strong beast leaned forward and tugged the heavy wagon up a rather steep hill. Less than a mile to go, Basil whispered to himself. Getting Walter to the soldier camp had been a far more difficult task than Basil had anticipated. Securing a team of horses from the Billingsley barn had been extremely difficult. There were entirely too many British soldiers milling and lingering about the town. The fact that his home was serving as a makeshift British hospital seemed to attract the enemy soldiers in great numbers. It had taken Basil almost an hour to sneak the 2 huge animals, one at a time, through the rear door of the barn. Once he had the horses secured and hooked up to the wagon, he discovered that maneuvering the rig through the woods was more difficult than it had been only days before. The winding trails through the forest was extremely narrow and strewn with limbs from the recent spring storm. Some of those limbs were quite large. On multiple occasions, both Basil and Oliver had been forced to climb down from the wagon and clear debris from their path in order to reach the westward road that led to the camp. Basil stared southward down the wagon road and shook his head, disgusted. He had expected it to take less than an hour to get Walter to the army hospital, but it had been almost 4 hours since he had discovered his long-lost brother on the battlefield near Guilford Courthouse. Basil worried nervously for his wounded sibling. He uttered a silent prayer for Walter's well-being. Basil glanced over his shoulder at his passengers, both of whom lay silently in the back of the wagon. Walter's visible wounds had stopped bleeding, but he had still not regained consciousness. Little Oliver slept soundly, nestled against Walter's side. The lad snored lightly, uttering a raspy click that sounded almost like a purring of a cat. Basil smiled ever so slightly. He was amazed at how Oliver was able to sleep even in the hard, rough bed of the jostling wagon. Minutes later, the wagon topped the hill and Walter spied the American encampment. The place was a beehive of activity. Hundreds of soldiers were taking down tents, dousing fires, and loading wagons. Basil spied several formations of soldiers marching westward in the direction of the Quaker villages. The road in front of Basil remained blocked by a checkpoint about 100 yards outside the camp. A single lonely militiaman manned the post. He stepped reluctantly into the road in front of Basil's wagon and raised his French Charleville musket across his chest. "Halt!" he exclaimed. "No one is allowed into the camp." Basil exhaled, frustrated. "Mister, I do not have time for this. I have a wounded militiaman in my wagon, and I need to get him to the hospital now." The soldier marched toward the wagon to investigate. He glanced over the sideboards at the two bodies in the bed of the wagon. "What's wrong with the little one?" the soldier asked, curious. "Nothing. He is just sleeping." The soldier stared at Walter. Basil tapped his foot nervously against the footboard. He was growing impatient. "What is his regiment?" inquired the soldier. "I do not know, but he is the brother of Captain James Billingsley." The militiaman's left eyebrow raised high. "Of the Rowan County Regiment?" Basil nodded. "How do you know that?" "Because he's my brother, too." Both the soldiers' eyebrows raised in surprise. "Indeed? Do you know where Captain Billingsley's company is? Do you know where Captain Billingsley's company is bivouacked?" "Yes, sir. I have been there before." "Good. Go on through then. If you are not going to find any But you are not going to find any doctors or hospital tents here. They've moved on to the west, to the troublesome ironworks. They are collecting casualties there." "Why so far?" asked Basil. "Because we lost the battle today. The British took the ground. We killed many of Cornwallis's soldiers, but those wretched redcoats drove us from the field." Basil's heart sank. He nodded and tipped the brim of his cocked hat. "Thank you for letting us into the camp, sir." The soldier smiled thinly and nodded. He quickly tilted his head in the direction of the camp. "You are most welcome. Now, go and find your brother. I am quite certain that he will be glad to see you and this wagon. We are running short on transportation for our wounded and our supplies." Basil snapped the reins and guided his team of horses through the chaos of the camp. A sleepy voice called from the back of the wagon. "Where are we, Basil?" "We are at the camp. We should be with James and the Rowan County boys here in just a bit." Basil heard leather scraping against the poplar floorboards in the wagon. Oliver slowly climbed over the seat and took his place beside Basil. "Did you have a nice nap?" the older boy teased. "Quite nice, thank you." He stretched and rubbed his stiff, aching shoulder. He quipped, "Now, I would really like some tea and biscuits, please." "Hopefully we can find some food here in the camp." Minutes later, Basil caught sight of his older brother, James. The captain was busy directing his men to load their supplies into a small hand-pulled cart. When the elder Billingsley saw Basil and Oliver, his eyes opened wide. He darted quickly toward the wagon. "Basil! Oliver! What in heaven's name are you boys doing here? What is wrong? Has something happened to Mother?" His voice sounded almost frantic. Basil and Oliver climbed down from the wagon seat. James grabbed them both and surrounded them with a huge bear hug. Basil replied, "No, James, Mother is fine. The British are in Guilford Courthouse, hundreds of them. They actually set up a hospital in our house. The place is crawling with redcoats, but Mother is fine. She's giving the British surgeons all kinds of grief." James grinned broadly. Well, Cornwallis should be pulling out of there soon. Our scouts say that they are already moving toward the southeast. They took the field, but at a very high price. I suspect they will be reeling from their losses for quite some time. But Basil, you did not answer my question. Why are you here? Mother sent Oliver and me to check the wounded in Sutton's Field after the British were over the hill. No one seemed to be caring for the American soldiers. We only found one man alive. He is someone you know. Basil nodded toward the wagon. James strode toward the rig and glanced over the side. His mouth hung open in disbelief. Oliver chirped, "It's your brother, Walter." "I know it is Walter, young man, but how did he come to be in the battle today? He is supposed to be in a British prison in South Carolina." Basil shrugged. "I have no idea, but here he is. And he's hurt, James. His legs are bloody, but will be all right, I think. But he took a strong blow to the head. He has not been awake since we found him." "How long ago was that?" "Just after dinner time. It's been several hours." James grimaced. "He needs to see one of our surgeons immediately. But they are all several miles to the west." "I know, at the ironworks," responded Basil. "The guard at the checkpoint told us." James thought for a moment. "You boys are going to have to come with us. We need the wagon anyhow. We have 4 other wounded men. We were afraid that we might have to leave them behind, but now we can load them in your wagon and get them to the surgeons as well." Basil nodded. "We can fill up any extra space with supplies." "Indeed," James affirmed. "Let us make haste. We must get our brother to the field hospital and quickly."